Captain Marcus Turner had just finished a long day in the skies. He was a skilled, experienced pilot who loved his job and took pride in every flight he completed. Today was no different. He'd flown hundreds of passengers safely to their destinations, and now he was ready to go home. Like many pilots, he had to fly as a passenger on his connecting flight back. Even though he was off duty, airline policy required him to wear his uniform. Marcus was used to it. He didn't mind, and in fact, he felt a certain pride every time he put on his uniform, knowing he represented thousands of hours of hard work, sacrifice, and dedication. As he walked through the airport to his gate, he couldn't help but notice a few people turning their heads and giving him an appreciative nod. He smiled back, quietly acknowledging their respect. It wasn't every day that passengers saw a black pilot, after all. Marcus knew that, and it made him even prouder to wear his uniform. As a trailblazer in his field, he knew the importance of setting an example and inspiring young people who might dream of a career in aviation. When it was time to board, Marcus patiently waited for his group to be called, scanning the crowd with his usual calm, observant gaze. He was booked in first class for the short flight, which was a nice bonus after a long day. Finally, his group was called, and he made his way down the jet bridge, feeling the familiar excitement of getting closer to home. Inside the plane, Marcus gave a friendly nod to the flight attendants as he stepped into the first-class cabin. It was an automatic gesture, the same one he used whenever he entered any plane, whether he was in the cockpit or just a passenger. He was looking forward to relaxing, maybe catching a short nap or reading a little to unwind. As he moved toward his seat, a senior flight attendant stepped in his path. She looked at him for a moment, then at his ticket, her eyes narrowing slightly as she scanned the details. "I think you might have the wrong seat," she said, her tone less than friendly. Marcus looked at her, a bit surprised, but politely clarified, showing her his ticket with a calm smile. The flight attendant, however, didn't seem interested in looking more closely. Her expression hardened, and she spoke in a low voice. "I think you'll need to sit in economy," she said, her words sharp and cold. Marcus felt a pang of confusion. He traveled enough to know his ticket was correct, but before he could explain further, she gestured toward the back of the plane, dismissing him as if he'd made a simple mistake. Marcus hesitated, feeling a sudden mix of frustration and embarrassment. He could feel the eyes of the passengers nearby, some watching with curiosity, others whispering among themselves. Marcus took a deep breath, deciding to let it go for now. He gave the flight attendant a calm nod and walked toward the economy section, still in his pilot's uniform. As he settled into his new seat, he wondered if anyone truly understood what he'd just experienced, and whether this flight would turn out to be more eventful than he anticipated. Marcus settled into his seat in the economy section, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. As a pilot, he'd been on hundreds of flights, both in and out of uniform, and he'd never faced a situation like this before. But he didn't want to make a scene. He took a deep breath, reminding himself he'd be home soon, and focused on finding some way to relax. While getting comfortable, Marcus couldn't shake off how the flight attendant had looked at him. It wasn't just that she'd insisted he sit in economy. There was something in her tone, a certain dismissiveness, that left him feeling uncomfortable. He thought about what he could have done differently, but the more he went over it, the clearer it became that he hadn't done anything wrong. He had a valid ticket for first class, just like any other passenger. Still, he tried to let it go, choosing to stay calm and avoid any unnecessary tension. As passengers continued boarding, Marcus noticed that some of them seemed to recognize him from earlier when he'd been in the first-class cabin. He saw a few curious glances thrown his way, as if people were trying to piece together why a man in a pilot's uniform was seated in the economy section. Most people didn't stare for long, but the quiet murmurs and occasional looks made him feel more out of place than he'd ever felt on a plane. A young woman sitting across the aisle gave him a small smile, her eyes filled with curiosity rather than judgment. She had a magazine in her hand, and from her quick glances between him and the pages, it looked like she might have recognized him. Marcus returned the smile, hoping it would bring some normalcy to this strange situation. She didn't say anything, but her friendly look seemed to reassure him that not everyone saw him as out of place. A few rows ahead, an older woman watched him with a frown, clearly less welcoming. She whispered something to her husband, who glanced back briefly before shrugging and looking away. Marcus noticed, but kept his attention forward, not wanting to read too much into it. He reminded himself that people react to things they don't understand, often without realizing how it might make others feel. Still, being on the receiving end of those stares was harder than he expected. As the final boarding announcements played, Marcus focused on the hum of the plane, a sound he knew so well and found oddly comforting. In that moment, he was just a passenger like everyone else. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone or explain himself. But even as he tried to relax, he couldn't help but wonder if the flight attendant's decision had been more than just an error. Just as Marcus was beginning to settle in, the senior flight attendant who had redirected him to economy returned to the first-class cabin to help other passengers. Her name tag read Linda Walker *, and she appeared calm and composed as she went about her duties. However, Marcus couldn't help but feel a lingering tension whenever he caught a glimpse of her from his seat. It wasn't just her tone earlier that had caught him off guard. It was the firmness with which she'd insisted that he didn't belong in first class, almost as if it was a matter of principle. Marcus tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it had been a mix-up. But something about her behavior lingered in his mind. Why hadn't she even taken a closer look at his ticket? Why the cold tone? These small details kept nagging at him, especially since he'd been a pilot with the airline for years and knew how things usually went. He decided to let it slide, reminding himself he'd be home soon enough. Passengers were still settling in, stowing their bags and chatting with each other, and the cabin buzzed with activity. As Linda moved through the first-class aisle, she spoke politely to the other passengers, handing out blankets and offering to help with carry-ons. Marcus noticed her demeanor had shifted completely. Now, she was all smiles and pleasant words. Seeing this, he wondered why she'd been so quick to dismiss him earlier, especially when he was wearing his uniform. At one point, Linda made eye contact with him briefly before looking away, her expression unreadable. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes to Marcus. It was as if she'd wanted to pretend he wasn't there, tucked away in economy, out of sight and out of mind. The whole situation felt surreal, and Marcus was left feeling like he was the only one aware of the tension that had unfolded. Nearby, a family with 2 young children settled into their seats, clearly excited for their trip. The kids glanced at Marcus's uniform, their eyes lighting up as they realized he was a pilot. One of them, a boy around 8 years old, nudged his mom and pointed discreetly in Marcus's direction, whispering something with a big smile on his face. Marcus gave the boy a friendly nod, which made the boy's face break into an even bigger grin. The innocent moment lifted his spirits, reminding him of the joy he felt every time he inspired a young person. But the warmth of that moment quickly faded when an older couple seated nearby exchanged knowing glances, as if silently commenting on his presence in the economy section. The husband's frown deepened as he muttered something under his breath to his wife. Marcus pretended not to notice, but the whispers were hard to ignore. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a simple seating error. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Marcus settled back in his seat, trying to focus on the flight itself. He knew the familiar routine and movements of the aircraft, and it gave him a strange sense of peace. But as they climbed into the sky, he couldn't shake the lingering question in his mind. Why had Linda assumed he didn't belong in first class? And what was it about him that had made her so certain of that? As the plane leveled off and reached cruising altitude, Marcus tried his best to relax and let the events of boarding slip from his mind. He took a deep breath, listening to the familiar hum of the engines, which usually brought him a sense of calm. Today, though, it was different. His mind kept going back to Linda's dismissive attitude and the looks he'd received from some of the passengers in economy. It wasn't what he expected after a long day of work, especially as someone who had dedicated years to his job. The cabin crew began their rounds, offering drinks and snacks. A younger flight attendant, a cheerful woman named Sarah, stopped by Marcus's row. She didn't seem to recognize him as a pilot and treated him like any other passenger. Marcus ordered a coffee, appreciating her friendliness. It was a small comfort that helped lift his spirits, even if just a little. But moments later, as Sarah moved down the aisle, Linda reappeared, walking past Marcus on her way to the front of the plane. This time, she didn't look at him or acknowledge his presence. Marcus's eyes followed her briefly before he looked away, deciding he'd had enough of thinking about it. Maybe it was just an odd misunderstanding, he told himself. People were human, after all, and sometimes they made snap judgments that didn't mean anything. He tried to focus on that thought. Around him, passengers were chatting, some watching movies, while others settled into their seats with books. The boy from earlier gave Marcus another shy smile, clearly still excited by the sight of a real-life pilot in his section. The innocence of that small gesture warmed Marcus's heart, and he smiled back, happy to brighten someone's day. But a voice nearby disrupted the moment. A woman in the row ahead was whispering loudly enough for others to hear. She leaned toward her seatmate, a friend perhaps, and said, "Do you think he's really a pilot? I mean, why would they make him sit back here if he were?" Her words weren't directly aimed at Marcus, but the doubt in her tone stung. The friend gave her a shrug and glanced back at Marcus, then quickly looked away, as though she felt embarrassed for being caught looking. The whole thing felt surreal to Marcus. He hadn't expected to feel like a stranger on his own airline. Just as Marcus was trying to brush off these thoughts, a middle-aged man in the seat beside him cleared his throat. "Excuse me," the man said quietly. "I don't mean to pry, but are you really a pilot?" He seemed genuinely curious, not judgmental, and Marcus appreciated the straightforward question. Marcus nodded with a slight smile, saying, "Yes, I am. Just catching a ride home after a long day." The man's face relaxed, and he smiled warmly. "Thank you for all you do. Must be a hard job." Marcus nodded, grateful for the kindness. He didn't need recognition, but hearing a kind word was a relief. For a moment, he felt understood. But not long after, Linda passed through economy again, her expression tight. She noticed the man talking to Marcus and gave him a brief, stern glance. It was almost as if she disapproved of the friendly exchange. Marcus saw it, but pretended not to, choosing to keep the conversation light with his neighbor. Despite his efforts to stay positive, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Linda's treatment of him had more to it than a simple seating error. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the thought gnawed at him. All he wanted was a quiet, peaceful flight home. But now he was left wondering if that was even possible. As the flight continued, Marcus tried his best to focus on the positive, remembering his conversation with the man beside him and the boy's shy but genuine admiration. Still, Linda's cold behavior and the whispers of doubt around him kept circling in his mind. He didn't want to overthink it, but it was becoming harder to ignore. A little while later, Marcus noticed that Linda was making another pass through the cabin, this time stopping by various passengers to check on them. As she got closer to Marcus, he wondered if she'd acknowledge him or maybe even apologize for the seating mix-up. After all, he was sure that by now, she'd have realized he was, in fact, a pilot with a valid first-class ticket. But as she came near his row, she only offered a brief glance, as if he were just another face in the crowd. Marcus thought about saying something, maybe politely asking her why she had moved him. But before he could make up his mind, the older woman from earlier, the one who'd given him disapproving looks, leaned over the aisle and spoke directly to Linda. "Excuse me, ma'am, I don't mean to cause trouble, but isn't he," she said, pointing subtly in Marcus's direction, "sitting in the wrong place?" I thought pilots have designated areas. It just doesn't seem right, does it? Linda gave a tight smile and nodded, almost as if she agreed. It's just a policy matter, she said quietly, as if discussing something confidential. We try to make sure everyone is comfortable in the right place. She didn't look directly at Marcus as she said it, and her words seemed to add to the mystery rather than explain it. Marcus listened in silence, realizing that anything he said might come across as defensive or upset. Instead, he simply met Linda's gaze, hoping his calm expression would convey his professionalism. But Linda's attitude seemed to affect more than just the people around him. He noticed a few more passengers casting curious glances his way, whispering among themselves with raised eyebrows. He wasn't one to let gossip or assumptions get to him, but the whole situation felt surreal. He'd been in enough tight situations as a pilot, storms, engine problems, emergency landings, but here, sitting as a passenger, he felt entirely out of control. As the meal service began, Linda returned to hand out trays to the passengers, working her way from the front of the economy section to the back. She served each row with a smile, making small talk here and there. But when she reached Marcus's row, her polite manner seemed to drop. She handed him his tray without a word, barely looking at him, and quickly moved on to the next row. Marcus noticed the difference immediately. It was subtle, but it was there. The man sitting beside him raised an eyebrow, as if he'd noticed too. Strange, isn't it? He murmured under his breath, clearly sensing the tension. Marcus nodded, choosing not to say much. The man added, "You know, I don't know what's going on, but it seems unfair. You're in uniform, after all. I'd expect a little more respect." Marcus appreciated the comment. It reminded him that not everyone saw him the way Linda seemed to. But even so, he couldn't shake the growing frustration and discomfort. Why was he being treated differently? He had every right to sit in first class, yet he'd been dismissed and made to feel out of place. Just then, the young woman across the aisle, the one who'd smiled at him earlier, caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod. She seemed to sense that something was off, and her supportive expression made Marcus feel a little more grounded. Maybe it was just the natural kindness she radiated, or maybe she truly understood the weight of the situation. In that moment, Marcus decided that no matter what happened next, he wouldn't let it change who he was or how he treated others. He'd spent years in the aviation industry, breaking down barriers and proving himself through his hard work and dedication. He wasn't about to let one uncomfortable experience undo all of that. But as he sat there, silently enduring the glances and whispers, he couldn't help but feel that this was a situation that called for more than silent resilience. Something needed to change, and maybe, just maybe, his presence on this flight would spark that change in a way he hadn't expected. Just as Marcus was settling into his decision to stay calm and let the flight pass without further incident, the young woman across the aisle leaned toward him. She looked as though she'd been thinking about speaking to him for a while. She gave him a friendly smile and finally introduced herself. "Hi, I'm Alicia." She held out her hand, and Marcus shook it, returning the smile. "Nice to meet you, Alicia," he replied. Her warm, kind expression made him feel at ease, as if she understood more than she was letting on. Alicia's eyes sparkled with curiosity, but she didn't jump into questions right away. Instead, she simply asked, "Long day?" Marcus chuckled, sensing she had a good feel for reading people. "You could say that," he replied, his tone light but sincere. There was something calming about her presence, and he could tell she wasn't looking for gossip. She genuinely seemed interested in getting to know him. After a pause, Alicia leaned in a bit, lowering her voice. "I actually recognized you from a magazine feature. You're Captain Marcus Turner, right?" Her tone held a note of excitement, like she was meeting a celebrity. "I remember reading about you, a groundbreaking pilot and one of the few who's made it to this level." Marcus's eyebrows raised in surprise. He hadn't expected anyone to recognize him, let alone a fellow passenger on this flight. You're right, he said with a nod. But I don't usually get recognized by passengers. I'm impressed. He laughed softly, appreciating the unexpected connection. Alicia grinned, her eyes filled with admiration. Well, I'm actually an aviation student myself. Reading about people like you, it's inspiring. It's not every day you meet someone who's broken barriers and done it with grace. As they talked, Alicia's excitement seemed to attract a few glances from nearby passengers, and soon others began noticing the exchange. A few people leaned in, listening with curiosity. It didn't take long before whispers spread throughout the economy cabin, and passengers who had previously cast doubtful looks were now paying closer attention. One man in the row behind them even spoke up, his voice carrying a tone of respect. "Wait, are you really a pilot?" he asked, looking at Marcus with newfound interest. Marcus nodded, confirming with a humble smile. "Yes, I am. Just off duty today, catching a ride home." The man's expression shifted, and he shook his head in slight disbelief. "That's incredible. I thought there was something special about you. You carry yourself like someone who knows what they're doing." Marcus chuckled at the compliment, and the warmth of the passengers around him started to shift the energy in the cabin. Alicia continued speaking, her voice full of admiration. "I can only imagine how many people you've inspired. You're a reminder that there are no limits, even in a field like aviation, where there's still so much change needed." Her words reached more than just Marcus, and it was clear that others in earshot were moved by her words. Linda, the flight attendant, happened to be nearby as Alicia spoke. She looked over, noticing the growing interest around Marcus. Her expression tightened, a look of surprise and maybe a bit of unease crossing her face. It was becoming clear to everyone, including Linda, that Marcus wasn't just any passenger in a uniform. He was a respected pilot with a unique story. Feeling the shift, the man beside Marcus gave him a supportive pat on the shoulder. "It's an honor to be sitting next to someone like you," he said warmly. "I can't believe I didn't realize sooner." Linda seemed unable to ignore the changing atmosphere. She took a step forward, her face uncertain. After a moment, she addressed Marcus, her voice softer than it had been earlier. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience. I hope your seat is comfortable." It was the first acknowledgement Marcus had received from her since she'd moved him. Though her words were simple, they seemed to carry a hint of apology, almost as if she realized that her assumptions might have been mistaken. Marcus looked at Linda, giving her a polite nod. He didn't need an apology to feel validated. The support from the passengers and Alicia's words were more than enough. But he could see that Linda's view of him might have started to change. As the flight continued, Marcus felt the atmosphere in the cabin grow warmer, the earlier tension replaced by curiosity and respect. Alicia's decision to speak up had sparked something, a reminder that respect and admiration could break through even the smallest walls of doubt. For the rest of the journey, Marcus spoke with Alicia about her aviation dreams, sharing stories of his experiences, challenges, and the moments that kept him motivated. Other passengers listened, some even joining in with questions and words of encouragement. Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his story and presence had made an impact on everyone around him. As the plane continued its journey, the mood in the economy cabin had transformed. Passengers around Marcus seemed more attentive and respectful, with several now openly curious about his experiences as a pilot. The initial awkwardness he'd felt was replaced by a sense of warmth and connection. It amazed him how a simple conversation with Alicia had opened the door to understanding and kindness among the passengers. Alicia continued asking him questions, her curiosity genuine and respectful. She wanted to know about his journey, the challenges he'd faced, and how he'd risen to become a pilot in a field where diversity was still rare. Marcus shared stories from his early days in training, the long hours of studying, and the moments of doubt he'd had to overcome. "There were days I thought I'd never make it," he said with a smile, "but I kept pushing because I knew I belonged in the sky. No challenge was going to stop me." Other passengers were now leaning in, captivated by his story. The man next to him shook his head in admiration. "That's truly inspiring, Marcus. It takes a lot of courage to follow a path that's not always welcoming." A few rows back, a mother with her young daughter listened closely. The girl's eyes widened as Marcus spoke about his first solo flight, how nerve-wracking it was, but how he found his confidence and strength mid-flight. He noticed her listening and gave her a reassuring smile. "Flying is a little like facing any big challenge," he explained. "At first, it seems scary, but once you trust yourself, you realize you can do it." The girl beamed, and her mother whispered a quiet thank you. Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his journey was inspiring others. He remembered how, as a young man, he looked up to pilots and dreamed of flying. Now he had the chance to be that inspiration for someone else. Linda, the flight attendant, was watching all of this unfold from a few rows away. She seemed to take in the respect Marcus was earning from the passengers, and her face softened as she observed their interactions. Her expression held something new, a mixture of surprise and perhaps even regret. She no longer looked dismissive. Instead, she seemed genuinely moved by the way Marcus was connecting with everyone. Finally, Linda made her way down the aisle and stopped beside Marcus's seat. For a moment, she looked at him, her expression almost apologetic. Taking a deep breath, she said, "Captain Turner, I want to thank you for sharing your experiences. I didn't realize how much you've done or the impact you've had. I apologize if I was quick to judge earlier." Her words were quiet, and although she didn't openly admit to any specific wrongdoing, it was clear she was trying to make amends. Marcus looked up at her, surprised by her approach. He could see that the earlier tension had lifted, and he gave her a polite nod. "Thank you, Linda." "I appreciate that," he replied, his tone warm but modest. He wasn't one to hold grudges, and he hoped this moment might lead to some understanding. Linda gave a small, appreciative smile and continued on her way, seeming to reflect on her earlier actions. Marcus sensed that perhaps this experience would leave a lasting impression on her, reminding her of the importance of treating everyone with respect and kindness, regardless of appearances. As the flight neared its destination, Marcus looked around at the passengers who had shown him such support. He was grateful, not just for the kind words, but for the chance to share his story with those who might take something valuable away from it. Alicia smiled at him from across the aisle, her eyes shining with gratitude and admiration. "Thank you, Marcus," she said quietly. "Hearing your story has been the highlight of my trip." Marcus gave her a grateful nod. "Thank you, Alicia. It's people like you who keep me going," he said, meaning every word. The encouragement and enthusiasm of the passengers had renewed his passion for what he did, reminding him that his work as a pilot was more than just a job. It was an opportunity to inspire and connect. As the plane began its descent, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace. He boarded this flight expecting nothing more than a quiet ride home, but instead, he'd found himself in a unique and humbling experience that had reconnected him with his purpose. He looked out the window as the ground came closer, feeling a quiet gratitude for the journey and for everyone he met along the way. As the plane began its descent, Marcus could feel the anticipation in the air. Passengers were starting to prepare for landing, fastening their seatbelts, stowing away trays, and securing their belongings. The hum of quiet conversations filled the cabin, and despite the usual end-of-flight routine, there was a unique sense of connection among everyone in economy. It was as if Marcus's story had somehow brought them all together. Alicia leaned across the aisle, catching Marcus's eye. "It's been such a pleasure hearing your story," she said with a warm smile. "I can't wait to get back to school and tell my classmates about meeting you. You've reminded me why I want to fly." Her words touched Marcus deeply, and he felt proud to know he had inspired someone with so much passion and drive. He nodded, his voice full of encouragement. "Keep working hard, Alicia. The skies are waiting for you." She grinned, clearly moved by his words, and Marcus knew she would carry this experience with her as she pursued her dreams. The little girl who had been listening earlier gave him a small wave, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I'd want to fly one day too," she said eagerly, her voice bright with hope. Her mother smiled, nodding in agreement. "And maybe one day you'll get to fly with Captain Turner as your pilot," she said softly, nudging her daughter. Marcus chuckled, his heart warmed by the girl's enthusiasm. "Well, young lady," he said, leaning toward her, "if you keep believing in yourself and working hard, I'm sure you'll make a great pilot one day." The girl's face lit up, and she nodded with determination, as if she'd already made up her mind. The mother mouthed a quiet thank you to Marcus, and he nodded back, feeling grateful for the chance to encourage someone so young. In those final moments before landing, Marcus felt something shift within him. The earlier frustrations with Linda and the uncomfortable start to the flight had faded away, replaced by a sense of gratitude. He realized that sometimes the most meaningful experiences come from unexpected moments, and it was often the small connections that made a difference. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he was more than just a pilot. He was someone who could inspire others to reach for their dreams. As the plane touched down and the familiar rumble of the wheels echoed through the cabin, everyone began clapping, a tradition on many flights, but one that felt particularly meaningful today. Marcus couldn't help but smile, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He hadn't expected this journey to be so profound, yet here he was, reminded of the impact he could have just by being himself. The passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. Alicia reached out one last time, giving Marcus a firm handshake. "Thank you, Captain Turner. You've given me more than inspiration. You've shown me what it means to truly believe in yourself." Marcus returned her handshake with a genuine smile. "It was my pleasure, Alicia. And remember, no matter what challenges come your way, stay focused on the destination. You'll get there." As the line of passengers started moving, Marcus saw Linda standing at the front of the cabin, her gaze directed his way. She looked as though she wanted to say something but was unsure of how to approach him. Finally, as he passed by her, she spoke quietly, her tone sincere. "Captain Turner, I want to apologize again. I made assumptions, and it wasn't fair to you. I didn't realize everything you've achieved. Thank you for your patience." Marcus looked at her, sensing the genuine regret in her words. He offered her a gentle smile, hoping to put her at ease. "Thank you, Linda. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we move forward." She gave him a nod, visibly relieved, and he hoped that she would carry this lesson forward, treating all passengers with the respect they deserved. As he stepped into the terminal, Marcus felt a sense of closure. This journey had started with tension and misunderstandings, but had ended with empathy, respect, and new friendships. He felt a deep satisfaction knowing that he had made an impact on the passengers and, perhaps, had changed a few minds in the process. Walking toward the exit, he noticed a few passengers from the flight smiling at him, nodding as they passed. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding of what they'd all experienced together. Marcus knew that he would remember this flight for a long time, not because of the initial frustrations, but because of the way people came together, reminding him of the power of connection and kindness. And as he stepped outside into the fresh air, ready to head home, he looked up at the sky with a renewed sense of purpose. As Marcus stepped out of the airport terminal and into the warm embrace of the afternoon sun, he took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of freedom and possibility. The flight had turned into more than just a simple journey. It had become a powerful reminder of the importance of connection, respect, and understanding. He glanced around, feeling the vibrant energy of people coming and going, each person carrying their own story, their own dreams. With every step toward the parking lot, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of gratitude. He thought about Alicia, the bright-eyed young woman who had rekindled his passion for aviation, and the little girl who dreamed of flying. He hoped that he had made a lasting impression on them, that they would remember this day and hold on to the belief that they could achieve their dreams, no matter the obstacles they faced. As he reached his car, Marcus noticed a group of aviation students standing nearby, their uniforms crisp and clean, talking animatedly about their aspirations. He paused for a moment, contemplating whether to approach them. He remembered what it felt like to be in their shoes, filled with excitement and uncertainty. Gathering his courage, he walked over to them, hoping to share a bit of encouragement. "Hey there," he called out, waving to get their attention. The group turned, surprised but curious. "I just got off a flight, and I couldn't help but notice your uniforms. Are you all studying aviation?" One of the students stepped forward, his eyes wide with excitement. "Yes, we are. We're just starting our training. It's a dream come true." The others nodded enthusiastically, their faces bright with passion. Marcus smiled, feeling the same spark of enthusiasm in them that he had felt years ago. "That's fantastic. Keep that fire alive. There will be challenges along the way, but don't let them stop you. Believe in yourself, and you'll find a way." The students listened intently, hanging onto his every word. "I can't believe we're talking to an actual pilot," one of the girls exclaimed, her voice filled with awe. "What's the most important lesson you've learned?" Marcus thought for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The most important lesson is to never stop learning. Every flight teaches you something new, whether it's about flying or about yourself. Embrace every opportunity and always be open to growth. The students exchanged excited glances, inspired by his words. Marcus continued, "And remember, you're not just pilots. You're role models too. Treat everyone with respect, no matter their background or experience. That's what makes this industry truly special." As he spoke, Marcus could see their enthusiasm bubbling over. They asked questions about his experiences, the challenges he faced, and the lessons he learned. He felt a sense of fulfillment sharing his journey with them, knowing that he might have a small impact on their futures. After a while, the conversation came to a natural pause. The students thanked him profusely, their eyes bright with excitement. Marcus felt a wave of joy wash over him. He had entered the airport just wanting to go home, but now he was leaving with a sense of purpose, knowing he had inspired the next generation of aviators. As he drove home, he thought about the flight and how it had changed him. The interactions with Alicia, the little girl, and even Linda had reminded him that every moment mattered, and every connection could lead to something greater. He was grateful for the opportunity to share his story and hopes that it had made a difference, even in a small way. Pulling into his driveway, he took a moment to appreciate the home he had worked so hard for. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over everything. He stepped out of the car and took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of clarity and motivation. In that moment, he realized he wanted to do more. Perhaps he could start mentoring young aviation students or visiting schools to talk about his journey. There was so much he could share, so many stories to tell. As he walked toward his front door, a smile spread across his face. Life was more than just about flying planes. It was about touching lives, sharing experiences, and helping others find their wings. He couldn't wait to see what the future held and how he could continue to inspire others on their journeys. With a heart full of hope and determination, Marcus entered his home, ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that he had made a difference today and that he could do it again tomorrow. The sky was vast, and so were the possibilities ahead.